Great. Well, thank you all for being here today for a reading and conversation with Yasmine Seale, Robin Moja, and Marina Warner on the occasion of the coming out of Agitated Air, collection of poems that I will let Yasmine and Robin and Marina talk about in more detail. But I just wanted to thank Yasmine, Robin, and Marina for agreeing to participate in this event today. Also, thank you all for attending, and thank the John Coffin Memorial Trust for supporting this on the behalf of the University of London. For myself, it's really exciting to have kind of three of the most kind of inspirational literary practitioners kind of working today together in one kind of virtual room to talk about such an exciting body of work. And just to quickly introduce kind of Yasmine Seale is a writer and translator. Her essays, poetry, and translations from Arabic and French have appeared in quite widely in Harper's, Poetry Review, Wasafiri, and elsewhere. And some of her current projects include a new translation of The 1001 Nights, published by W.W. Norton, and a translation of the poetry of Al-Khansa, which is published by NYU Press. And we also have Robin Moja, who is a translator of Arabic to English, who has recently moved to Cape Town from Barcelona. And his translations of prose and poetry have appeared in Black Box Manifold, The White Review, Asymptote, and others. And he's also translated several novels and prose works. Most recently, Haytham Al-Wardani's The Book of Sleep and Slipping by Mohammed Khair. And we also have the pleasure of having Professor Marina Warner with us, who is a writer of fiction, criticism, and history. And her works include novels and short stories, as well as studies of art, myths, symbols, and fairy tales. She's Professor of English at Birkbeck College, at University of London, and a Distinguished Fellow at All Souls College, University of Oxford. So I'm going to leave the introductions here because I don't want to speak too much and be able to open up the floor to Yasmine, Robin, and Marina. For the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes, Yasmine and Robin will read from Agitated Air, and these readings will be interspersed by conversation with Marina. We will then follow this with about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A, so we'll open up the floor to your questions, so please feel free to note them down for later on. Just quickly, one thing I didn't mention was that Agitated Air has been recently published by Tenement Press, and you can order a copy online. I'm going to post the link now in the chat. So I'm going to open up to Yasmine and Robin and Marina now. So
thank you so much, B, for, can you hear me? Is that all right? Yeah, thank you, B, for making this happen, and thank you to the Warburg for hosting us. And thank you, Marina, always for your enthusiasm and your support for this project since long before it was a book. It's wonderful to be launching it with you into the air. Before launching into the readings, we are going to give a tiny bit of background about Ibn Arabi and what we've done with him. To give just the most rudimentary sketch of one of the most important philosophers. As many of you know, Ibn Arabi was one of the great Muslim philosophers and spiritual teachers. He's sometimes described as the person who gave the esoteric or mystical dimensions of Islam philosophical expression. He's sometimes described as a Sufi, which is not a term that he himself used. He was born in 1165 in southern Spain, but at some point in his early life, seems to have received some kind of vision calling him to travel east. He made the pilgrimage to Mecca and never went home. He never returned to Spain. He continued to travel and settled in Damascus, which is where he died and where his shrine is still. Mecca was transformative. It's there that he began writing his philosophical masterwork, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, the Meccan Revelations or Illuminations, which is an enormous 10,000 page compendium of his spiritual writings. It's a kind of personal encyclopedia. But another thing that happened in Mecca is that he seems to have fallen in love with a young woman, and he begins writing poems about this experience, which he collects in a book called Tarjumãn Al-ashwãq. There are about 60 poems, and they're sort of about wanting to commune with the divine, and they're sort of about wanting to be close to another person, and they're sort of both, and they're about being lost. The name of this young woman was Nizam, which means system or order or harmony, and the poems play with this idea of a system being disordered, or some kind of order being thrown out of joint. And they're poems about circling some desired thing, circling, which is the kind of central gesture of the Hajj, but it's also more generally about coming close to and never quite reaching the longed for thing. And this movement, this tide-like movement of constantly approaching and never quite being there. The poems are what are called nasibs, which is an ancient poetic form, which is very closely associated with love poetry. It's from a pre-Islamic form, which is to do with visiting the remains of an encampment where the beloved was and has moved on from. So it's to do with remembering and yearning for something that is no longer there. And he writes these 60 nasibs, and he's criticized for using this, what is really an erotic form, to write about the experience of revelation. He produces a second edition of the Tarjumãn, of this collection, which is heavily footnoted and explains every sensual or erotic image with reference to his philosophical system. And ever since then, really, the Tarjumãn has been read in light of that second edition and in light of his philosophy more generally. But I think what they do so beautifully as poems is embody that tension. They are about love as a revelatory experience, I think. A few years ago, I began reading these poems, and I read some translations that Robin had made, which were floating around online, and we began writing to each other about these poems. And maybe, Robin, you could tell us what happened next.
Right. That's a great introduction, because there's a couple of things there. First of all, to skip over exactly what happened next, we started thinking about the idea of both translating the poems together, and as a preamble to that, we started to send each other translations, and very quickly, within working on what became the first sequence in the book that's been published, we decided to do it in a sort of epistolary form. And so from the beginning, we found the form that we were to continue throughout the collection. And that was that we picked a poem together from the Tarjumãn, and each translated it ourselves separately. And when we were done, and we were both done, we sent it to the other person. And then they would take that first translation and produce a second translation in response to that first translation, but also working from the poem. So every single poem is bound to the one that came before it, or perhaps the ones that came before it, and to the original, the Arabic. And then also, as the sequences developed, to the sequences that have gone before. So there's lots of kind of eddies inside the process anyway. It creates lots of circling. And that was for the entire process until quite late. Purely for ourselves, I think it was a conversation. It was a conversation back and forth, and it was a way to write to each other and to enjoy the work, and to also place maybe a constraint on the possibility of it becoming exhausting or falling apart, that there's a little structure and form you have to follow. But that's how it came about. And we produced a number of sequences, and the book that is published is perhaps, so it's redacted, as it were. Not all of the sequences are in there, and not all of every part of every sequence, even the ones that are published, is present. So it's itself more, in reality, maybe, if you could say that the project is a more straggly and bigger thing. And this is what's in the book is a neater and sort of structured thing put together for a book that's out of that material.
Yeah. Shall we? We thought we'd read a couple of sequences to begin, and then talk a bit about them, and then read some more. So we're about to read 2 sequences of 6 poems each, and as Robin described, each sequence responds to one Arabic poem. Each Arabic poem generated a number of English poems, usually 4 or 6. So these 2 sequences, one of them is sort of about binaries of absence and presence collapsing in certain kinds of experience, which is a theme that recurs in the book. And the second one is about mourning a departed, unspecified they. And as you'll see, we take that complaint in different directions. I'll just show you the poems as we read them. Sorry, I've lost it. So I'll start with my first version and we'll proceed alternately. Distance and desire ruins me. To meet is no relief. Come or go, desire hardly cares. Meeting him, unreckoned things happen. In place of healing, another ache of longing. Because to meet him is to see a person whose beauty grows prouder with abundance. No cure, but to set my steady love to his sliding scale.
I can be away and floored by longing, but it doesn't help when we're together. Longing without and in her company. With her, this thing happens to me. I never dreamt that it could be this. The medicine, just more viral passion. To see someone and be with them, their beauty blooms and bloats. A passion is pegged to beauty rising at fixed rates.
I'm not there, nothing but longing, meeting no help, presence irrelevant to pain. Being there finds me unprepared, no antidote but pressing where it hurts. Every time you grow lovelier, more like a flower than the last, and know it. Nothing for it as you part the waves, but steadily to water ski in your wake.
Forbearing, hollowed by longing, for what when held will keep unhealed. The wound rubbed clean burns again flowering, brighter and wider to touch. Pretty it grows and hurts accordingly.
And this next version, oh no, sorry. Cause of death, time apart, they'll say. So let us meet, same agony, regardless of where you are, desire. I didn't think it would happen to me. Wound will not scar. It wants to be lanced again by that dart, that proud face of yours, always leaping ahead of its beauty. What hope for my heart, but to be drawn along, in well-tempered leaps.
I take myself outside that feeling frame, and longing comes to break me up again. Wrapped in arms again, I'm no more there than gone. You never saw it coming, holding together to come apart. Sensing this thing up close was beautiful and was growing more so over you, that there was a pattern, that it would be harder to hold the closer you got.
I was going to say about this final version that it was written the day Stephen Hawking died, and I was reading about his life and his work on space and physics, and the speaker in this poem, which began as a lover, in this version seems to have become the moon. What would it mean to move out of your orbit? Into what long night? No fun being locked here, bright face always turned to your indifference. How could I have known it would be hard to live on radiance alone? But if I must, let me not want more than this field, this tender to and fro in equal time. Let it do. So I think we'll go straight into the next sequence and then discuss.
Right. No more standing it or bearing now, they are no more. Are no more here, yet they stand in the dim hall still of your heart. Ask after them to hear they rest, that Ben and Sheikh perfume their air. You might touch these words to wind, run after them, and there, as they sit in the dim still shade of the trees, from your heart growing shades as they leave, make them hear.
They move on. Ease, all comfort follow. Gone, they are no less lodged in the heart's hollow. I wonder where the riders rest at noon, and whispers answer they sleep where desert wormwood tang and willow meet. To the wind, pleading, race until you reach them, for in the shade of trees, entangled, they are still. And remember, please, this mangled heart to the departed.
The strength it takes to stay when they got clear, I gave it up, they're ghosting the dark hollow, oh my heart, in haunted wondering is shown. They idle in a pillowed by airs, ascetic wormwood and cool bend shade paradise, where only wind can reach them. I command it, bring them brokenly my plea, peace. Apartness among us is grief to me, who holds you home.
This next version was an attempt to extend the domain of the departed, and it became a poem about extinction. And how shall we go on breathing when we're done smoking them out? In poems, they can be still swarming, gasping in the sweet atmosphere of trees we have forgotten how to name, or say anything but lamely sound alarms on faster borrowed breath, as though nature were out there, like a lover you'd learn to live without.
The air clears before you. There is an emptiness into which strength falls and falls. Inside you, they're dark cutouts, alive like sunspots, and you are blind. Behind questions come dreams, their fires incensing the air moving as if sent, as if the shadow falling conveyed your absence.
And this last one is an erasure of John Donne's The Flea. How little is, now cannot be said. More than we would spare, you and I, cloistered, apt to kill in sudden innocence. Weaker now, learn how to waste.
Which last line was almost a title for the book?
What was the title? Yeah.
I think that one of the remarkable and enthralling things about the collection is what you capture in the phrase, the tender to and fro. But it's also an act of very, very free and experimental translation that's actually exhilarating. But as you are both, translators who sometimes give versions that are, as it were, the more conventional, paraphrases, as Dryden called them, paraphrases of other texts in other languages. I would like to hear from both of you what the experience was like, because this is, to my mind, more like the Diabelli variations or the Goldberg variations. There's a kind of tune in the poem, which is a sequence of images, if you like, which we can see ghosted in your versions. Then this tune comes back, but at the same time you're playing with it very richly and inventively and freely, above all.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, was it fun to be so free?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's why it was possible for us to do this in the first place, because we were doing it for each other. We were writing backwards and forwards. So, and we weren't necessarily, for an audience or thinking about translation, quite like, how does our text relate to the Arabic? Why have we didn't have to do that, because we were both reading the Arabic and translating. So that in itself is a liberating space in which to translate. But also it's an extension of something, for me, that happens in translation anyway. That you are, the aspects of the text you're listening to and developing in your translation, or using a translation to get into the text in different ways. It's just that it's taken further in this space. It's taken much further, and
it's using the translation to write as well. I think, to find one's own voice. I mean, this is often true when you go deep into someone else's work. What you discover is your own voice, and the surprising thing about these versions is that they had a way of revealing our own concerns, things that we wanted to write about within the constraint of the response to these ancient poems. They were ways about writing about all kinds of things.
Right, and I love that.
Yeah, I mean, the call and response element between you two, I think, am I right in thinking that you hadn't actually met at that point? Is that right?
Yeah.
So this was a kind of form of, yes, when you say epistolary, it was long distance. Because you were then in South Africa.
I was in South Africa then.
I'm in Istanbul.
And this idea of absence and presence.
Yes.
In that last sequence, these ideas of distance and proximity come under strain, particularly when it's email correspondence. You could be writing from different continents or from the other side of a room, and it feels the same.
Right.
But it's interesting because it mirrors very much what's actually happening in the poems. I mean, that's what's so interesting. There's the dialogue between you two across distance is also like these yearnings and lost.
Absolutely, and that tension between so many of these poems circling is something Yasmine said, but also they're about poems of approach without a rival. Yeah. And you can be, as you just said, you can be on the other side of the world or be in the same room, but really you can't get any closer than that. And that's maybe you can come within, you can come very close in this sort of process, but not cross the final distance.
Yeah. And it mirrors also the act of translation that as you're practicing it, the meaning is also constantly distanced. I mean, you're nearly upon it, but not quite.
Yes.
Yes, and it's a way of, for the reader who doesn't read Arabic, it's a way of giving you all these different ways into the ghostly, this kind of phantom parent poem, rather than just one translation. You have many ways of imagining this kind of central void. Etel Adnan, who died recently, poet and wonderful painter Etel Adnan, wrote beautifully about Ibn Arabi and described him as a person carried to shore on a wave, and the same wave takes him away and then carries him back. There's this kind of tide-like movement in the poems. The poems are in movement. And they're also moving back into the deeper, the kind of partially buried meanings of the tradition that he's working in, which is already remote by the time he's writing.
Do you just want to comment a little bit on your choice of title? I mean, I love it. It's a wonderful phrase, Agitated Air. But it's very, very far from the Interpreter of Desire, which is the literal translation, if you like.
Well, it's actually it's a line from one of the poems that we'll read. Shall we do a bit more reading and then we can talk?
Yes, go ahead, yes.
Yeah, shall we? Okay. Oh, sorry, pardon me. Got to do my windows.
So this is another sequence. Is there anything we'd like to say about it, or should we dive in?
Well, maybe that the first poem that I'm going to read is actually one of the poems I'd done that predated the project or the conversation or whatnot. So anyway, it's also maybe, I think, the first one we've done that introduces a place name and something very specific about the landscape he was writing about. And so this is maybe, anyway, this is the first one to have a place name and sort of root it more specifically in the original text and the kind of the environment they came out of. I don't mean the geographical environment. It was for us in Abrakan, lightning glimmering, ribs drummed by thunder's clouds poured out on every grove, and all those dancing boughs which bend your way. Creeks broke in flood, the breeze was redolent, a ringdove glid, a twig became a spray. They raised their red-domed tents between serpent rills. Between them sat young women. They were shining bright, rising like the suns. Their eyes were large and beautiful, gentle blood, first class, supple.
At Abrakan, the meeting place of bright and dark, light came to us in blasts, their clatter a drum in the ribs, their clouds watering everything green, every dizzy to meet you meander. Streams running over, wind turning sweet, a ringdove darting, in its place on the branch, a leaf. Red domes rose between the earth's veins, between whose snaking sat bright talking suns, eyes lifting, rare and giving, agile.
It was for us in Abrakan, a broken ground, a bricolage of dark with light, that lightning shone, which threw our ribs with thunder, and its clouds the bellied boughs and meadows doused, and blew the banks of streams. The air was full with sweet release and birds, the sticks with leaf. And there we saw the rise of red tents set, by whom between the snaking waters sat they, white suns lifting, eyes which held they gave these queens a sway.
In this place only partly itself, where light calls a truce, tangos with shadow, signature practice in the sky. Our ribs, not built for improvisation, caved under the timpani. Everything got wet, then drunk, even the edges. Now sweetness in agitated air. The tree is pulling buds out of a hat. Someone has put up tents, avoiding the snakes that are water knowing its place. Someone is sitting, blazing, all eyes and grace. Do we have one more of yours? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's just, it puts in your heads. Firelight, heat, oxygen balloons to bang bodies in a drum shell booms waves from cloudhead to grassy. The line branches shiver and smear scent, birds and green across the air. But through the shimmer, some principles establishing. Red tents that dot apart between the strokes of smooth snake streams, poised and bright, and seeing everything are seen.
We could read 2 more poems from a sequence. Just Robin's first version and my second. Doves in the Trees.
Yes. Yeah. So this is, I suppose, very quickly to say, this is quite a famous poem, or this poem contains in the middle of it a quote or a piece of verse that is quoted when Ibn Arabi is mentioned. It's like the most online bit of Ibn Arabi, for example, and often in relation to the fact, the sort of non-ecumenical, which is something that occurs in a lot of the other poems as well. But anyway. Doves in the trees, be careful. You perform sadly and make me sadder, carefully, or your long cries will prize my secret loves out and open sorrows like clams. Take the propositions which go back and forth, whining between us in half-light. Little ghosts flit through tamarisk, its branches bend down to me and send me away. Bring me that pushy need and passion and the most keen sufferings, all of it. I mean, who do I have left? In Jama'a, no one. No one in Muhasab by Minar, no one in Dhat al-Ahr, no one in Na'man, and all out of love and insistence, constantly circling my heart, bumping it with their muzzles. Best of them all, circling the Kaaba and finding it lacking. The speaker, laying his lips on its stones. What does that house hold over man? A promise never to change. What faith can you place in dark-dyed dressings? One most amazing thing is a wild gazelle, whose face is all ablaze and gesturing. Grape red fingertip flicking, flickering lids at pasture between the breastbone and the meat, extraordinary. Green grass walled in fires. The shape of my heart unstable becomes a pasture for gazelles, a house of monks, of idols, a Kaaba to turn about, a Torah's turning leaves, Quran. Take love. Where its caravans drive is faith, and a spreading map grows on a pattern. Fish lines round Hind, round her sister, Qais's Layla, May by Ghailan. You're muted.
Sorry, drowning out the ambulances. What's so interesting about this poem is these the place names and the names of famous lovers. He's writing at the end of a tradition or after the end of a tradition, but writing in this form which is already ancient, which is a pre-Islamic one. And my next version sets the Nasib in a kind of fallen urban landscape where these stations of pilgrimage or of desire might be imagined as stations, as a train in movement. Not even birdsong calms me now. Louder now to be heard over flight path, light throwing life patterns, singing sooner nesting, now it's hotter. But when I'm caught crying and the grass lets me mouth the danger of your name, I'll stay hungrily until dark. The trees are shaking, feeling for a grammar, but to see without this seeking meaning, how? This rush to make mine, but where is they? Never not spinning in here, elbowing the limits. Take circle to name what escapes change. The circle line was changed to a lasso, loop broken to keep the fallen asleep from whiffing infinity. You say grasps as if the body didn't. Even so, until your philosophy grows a pair of opposable thumbs. We make promises as if skin didn't renew itself completely, and anything maintained is hard work mistaken for miracle. If you want to feel something amazing, eye contact with anyone said to rush love hormones to the brain, since you are too far to touch and the meadows actually ablaze. But look, you found me easy at the melting point, after all the hours perfecting backbends in the wrong mirror, So work me to your heart's changes, and I'll tip all this plastic love into whatever shape will make a heaven of the last soft, overdetermined sky. And I think we'll skip the last last version.
Absolutely beautiful, that. But I think there are two aspects that would be worth hearing you say a bit more about. One is how you handled both the references to the past Nasib conventions, and how you actually broke through that with the anachronisms that you use, throughout actually the collection. And I think that there's also a sort of question that can be raised in relation to the difficulty of translating this kind of material, which is what Said famously called Orientalism. By having the names of Laila and Gais, we sort of in a world of and perfume and doves, and we're getting near the kind of problems of. And I wonder, just maybe the anachronisms help to cut through that. Maybe that's part of the point of them.
I think so. And I think one of the things, as Yasmine mentioned, that this in his own time, the landscape described, the conceit of having people traveling on camels through the night, lovers looking over campsites of former loves, all the apparatus and the imaginary landscape of the Nasib is something that bore no relation to his own life. He wasn't a Bedouin lover. He was quite nice. He had a nice house in Damascus for a lot of it. He had lots of people. He was fine. He was very kind of urban, and he was an urban intellectual, but he was what he was. He was a man of towns and cities.
So it's politics for him too, to some extent.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I think by putting these things in, you attack yourself on the end of a tradition. You make it clear it's a tradition, but it's also important to have it in there because it does put it in an unreal landscape too. And then once you've done that, and it is an unreal landscape, and even for a contemporary reader who's reading in Arabic, for the majority of people who encounter this, they don't also know what these things signify. All those place names have a lot written about them. And then what do they signify? Their places, they symbolize this and they symbolize that, but most people don't think, you do encounter these poems, but encounter them without that knowledge. And it's interesting to put ourselves in that position. And then of course we move away from it, like Yasmine's poem. So I think what we're doing with it is, in terms of the Orientalist thing, it's creating a stage set and hopefully retaining its signification as well.
Yes, and these places that were real places become metaphors. Yes. His relation to that tradition is also a constructed one, as you say, and he's as far from it as we are from him. Yes. These place names are from a kind of desert world of pre-Islamic poetry, which no longer exists, and he's writing in a sort of degraded form of the Nasib, which formerly was the Nasib was the section that opened the ode, the qasida, and it involves a certain amount of bravado, the kind of braggadocio of the pre-Islamic poet, kind of boasting of his prowess, and that's all part of the convention at its origin. But by the time he's writing, it's become something else, and it's this period of great mystical renewal in Islam, the 13th century. But it's after the fall of the Caliphate of Cordoba, so even Andalusia is no longer what it was. So he's writing after the end of a tradition. So these images there are these recurring images of a lost garden or a lost home, which might have meant concrete things when they were first developed, but by the time he's writing,
but also it has that sense of yearning and distance, just like you say. Those were real places. Those are all place names, but they are for him and for anyone that would read in that tradition who was literate. They are also dream places.
Yes.
They're dream places that exist in reality, which is something like the Kaaba, or there's something very powerful about having a landscape that actually exists. You could travel between Gat al-Ajra and Naqa and Lala and places like Dusalam, which is the valley of, I think, Cyprus is.
Yes.
And these places.
It's a sort of sacred landscape.
Sacred, but also not. Also one of secular love poetry. It's a landscape of signification.
Can you talk a little bit more about the transcendental metaphysical side? Because after all, that's actually, Ibn Arabi has a kind of cult following as a metaphysical master. So, to this day, very strong. So, because I think you believe that it's not binary, that it's not an opposition between the metaphysical and the physical, but actually there is some kind of way that he's creating a poetic synthesis there. Well,
they poems, I suppose, is how I think of them. So everything in them is true. It's a stupid way to put it, maybe.
Yeah, or that binary was maybe something that was imposed on them, or
yes.
The poems, because he was so influential, as you say, as a philosopher and a kind of spiritual teacher, the poems were almost read in a sort of extractive way to kind of, in order to try and understand his spiritual system. But as poems, they're always doing more, or they're sort of embodying.
Well, he produced even an edition in which he reduced it to that, where he was like, well, but one thing that's not mentioned is there are poems in the collection from the beginning that he talks explicitly about how he's using imagery and metaphor. He's saying, what do I mean when I talk, because what do I mean when I talk about a wrist or the breast of a statue or a gazelle? And he does it in an extraordinary way. He doesn't answer the question. He just goes round and round with it. He's like, I'm dressing the branches with leaves, or I'm dressing the branches with flesh. I'm putting smiles on lightning. He's got this wordplay between the word for a gazelle and the word for the disk of the sun, which is the same word, or it can be the same word, how you choose your vocabulary. And which is itself a trait of Arabic poetry of this type, where there's there's a sort of melty, buttery thing where you go between human forms and landscape and animal forms, and you don't ever settle on one being an image of the other. They all contain each other. It's a peculiar thing. So, yeah. So,
and we could say something about the form of the poems. I mean, we've done all kinds of things formally, and that was part of the fun of being able to produce many different versions, was to not have to choose one form. But his poems are all rhymed, they're mono-rhymed, as almost all classical Arabic poetry is, which is something that's much easier to do in Arabic than in English. And I thought I would read one poem of mine, which is an attempt at monorhyme in English.
Yes.
But also, I just say, very interestingly, like the same kind of way it is in Arabic, not exactly. Rhyme as we might think of it. It's the repetition of a consonant and a vowel.
So this poem rhymes in an, which is the adverbial ending. So each final word, each line ends in a word which is a sort of invented adverb, which is something you can do very easily in Arabic. This was an exercise in inventing adverbs. Branches stoop like fathers down to cheeks digressively. So locks, so shoot of knots and pliant waves hang fluently. Boldness trails along the floor, lies under folds alluringly. Loveliness denied finds you accustomed and untested shyly. Lips unlock, loose hiccups purse and soak super deliciously. Stripped, expanses slide to dips, then billow incomparably. Conversation's witchery now stirs, now stills magnetically. Charms to hold a faithful heart in chains, surface sparingly. Mouth pearls apart to nurse the damned and broken liquidly. Gazes nail the coarsened killer's heart non-metaphorically. New moons from hollows rise and hold, anti-gravitationally. Tears enough to stuff a cloud, complain meteorologically. Skin and bone, dear as my blood, a girl gave to me readily and made things clear and ours, hers and strange, distractingly. Her eyes hold knives and smiling gouge out yours remotely. Friends, let us stop here. The shelter and Hajir, pleadingly, stop. Let me ask where they turned, for I went maplessly through wastes, my camel chafing at roads unrelentingly bare, her frame concave, hump gone, my haste hungrily sapping her speed all the way to Hajir. There, maillessly, camels shadowed a dire moon. I folded my ribs uneasily about it, even as, all bared, it circled me, and I, specularly, it. I looked for the traces it wiped as it went, fruitlessly. I wonder if we have time to read Garden of the Valley, or if we should move to the final sequence. We have a final sequence of 4 poems, and then we could continue the conversation and open it up.
I think you should probably go to the final sequence.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think so, if to bring in questions.
Yeah, so this is the final sequence is, it begins in Arabic with the word qif, stop, which is the classical word in pre-Islamic poetry and in classical poetry, which to do with asking your companions, your comrades, to stop so that you can remember and weep over the remains of what was once there, which reminds you of a love that has now moved on.
And it's, yeah.
Mm.
And it's to stand as well.
And
So you stop and stand over something.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Slow, nothing left. You are stopping to cry on hard shoulders again, quizzing the dregs. Tell me where is your love? There, in the misting beyond, like oases, huge in the haze, you see better this way. They went searching for clearer waters, a swell life. You have to go after for answers. Air only knows, are they settled or settling? Last seen in sore-heeled elapsing, cocooning beauty from heat. Can you track them? Go hot at their blistering, come through the rising, the falling. Not far now, the lights, look, your love is on fire. Stop. You're thrown to the lions, your hunger hallucinates soft.
They all move on, but you go back again to cry, a wreck. Oh, where is my love gone? Like you could see it, shimmering across the flats, mirage in the heat haze like trees, a bloom in the mist, looming huge in your eyes. It looks to get clear, life like water. Your thought gone after it like breeze. Here's a groan, an engine cooling in the heat. Sees it asleep, the canopying leaves, the tender safe in shade. Rally and race, you off again, scrambling and sliding. Now closer, its light is a flare in your love is the light of a flare, and the roar is a purr in your ears.
And these are the last 2 poems in the book, and the last 2 poems that we did. So if this isn't too much of a spoiler, the book has a kind of narrative shape. Months pass, a year. You're here still haunting what we had, scratching the phantom limb. Again's not some retrievable rush, it's what you can hope for, revolution or another poem. The staircase home's a tragic shape. All we can do is spiral, describe the loops and watch the epicenter dim. What's left? A bowl of vapor, questions, lights, a love that made you see things.
Time passes and makes room, a broken mouth, our hollowed home to haze and airs. What is left? To be seen there. What is sight? Firelight running round dark bodies and nothing in the night.
You're muted, Marina.
I think we can feel the shape of this beautiful book in those readings. Thank you so much. But I think one of the things that comes out that maybe we could talk about, because it relates to the metaphysical question, is who is addressing whom? In the Song of Songs, which is a similar kind of dialogue that had been allegorized as a lover's dialogue, the metaphysical poem, the speakers are pretty clear. There are two of them, really. But in these poems, the way you've done them, there are many, many different voices. There is a we, a you. And when Yasmine, of course, is reading, we can't help but see it in the feminine, in the female voice, especially as you've also been a translator for quite a while now of lots of women's poetry in Arabic. Yeah. So I identify it with Scheherazade in your 1001 Nights. So there's a sense in which the genders are not Ibn Arabi's voice, but your voice is kind of coming through. Mm. But also in Robin's versions, there are many different shifts. The viewpoint of the subject keeps shifting.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question because it jumps around in the Arabic as well.
Yeah.
Between who is being addressed is one question, but even who is speaking. Yes. There are these kind of ventriloquisms where sometimes the wind is speaking, or sometimes he's passing a message to the wind, who is feminine, who then becomes the speaker. Mm. And as to who's being addressed, there are all these phantoms. They're like layers of phantoms. Sometimes it's a you, sometimes it's a they, sometimes it's a he, which in the conventions of Arabic poetry can also mean a woman. There was one of the blurbs that we received for this book was a wonderful text by Holly Pester, who wrote a wonderful little essay about the book. And at the end, she said that the poems create a distant field of someone off the page, which is exactly that. There's always this sense of someone who is being remembered and missed, but who isn't there, and whose presence takes on these different forms.
Yeah, I love that. I don't really have anything to add. It just, while Yasmine was talking, also what you said about maybe when we're reading, but also when you're reading it, this is my version. There's a tension between the fact we're speaking to each other, and then all of this is going on, which I suppose I think of myself as conversational as well. Mm. That when you're speaking to somebody, and the conversation matters, there are so many other things going on, and these switching, these elisions and slipping between pronouns recreate some of that effect. If you're talking to somebody and you're trying to say something to them, but this is maybe making it very kind of basic, but if you're trying to say something to them, you're telling stories about other people. You're saying you're placing some of your feelings in the third person. Your forms, like you're telling, it's storytelling as well, switching around. And yes, but the Arabic also just makes you feel freer to do that as well. It's not just like the landscape of it, just like the imagery.
And it's often grammatically quite strange. Yes. It's often quite hard to say in the Arabic
what's going on,
who and what and who. Often what you have are just verbs and adverbs without a sense of a subject or an object. I feel they're quite kind of referential, that that is done because it touches on a reference or a cliche or a trope. Yeah. And that you understand this is usually expressed in the third person, even though the poems, yeah. So then it's the interesting thing of coming after a tradition, or coming so far after a tradition that you no longer have those references. And so they become ghosts. Mm.
There was a thing in the last, sorry, Yasmine, just in the last 4 lines of the poem, of your adverbial poem, that really kind of sums up a lot of this, actually. about something containing tradition and something, and also the sort of binary of metaphysical and kind of carnal or carnal love, and even the idea of metaphor being a distinct thing, you know, this image standing for this. I folded my ribs uneasily about it, even as all bared it circled me, and I specularly it. I looked for the traces it wiped as it went fruitlessly. So you contain something, you circle around something and enfold it, but it's still circling around you and enfolding you. And that's sort of
the traces is such a theme, remains as such a theme in Arabic poetry still. But certainly when he was writing, it's such a motif. But now it's taken on another meaning when there are traces that we no longer have access to. Or trees, you know, there's a line in one of my poems about trees we've forgotten how to name. There's a whole landscape that has now become inaccessible to us, or a whole layer of knowledge that we don't have.
I think an important aspect of this sort of uncertainty about the pronouns is that it doesn't leave the female object of desire as an object, because we enter her voice imaginatively again and again in these renderings. I mean, that may be an extrapolation on your part, but one of the things I wanted to ask you is if in Arabic you can use you meaning I mean, that you're speaking to yourself as you. And in fact, it's something because you've done that quite often in the poems.
I think he would have, I mean, in his philosophical writing about revelation, he attributes his spiritual awakening to this woman. So it's a love, but it's also a kind of, she's also a kind of spiritual guide. And this is not long before Dante and Beatrice. It's a kind of similar relationship. And he's maybe the philosopher who came closest to seeing the feminine as this sort of gate to the absolute or the divine.
Yes, they say that Dante might have been influenced by some of this poetry, but it hasn't been established. It does seem quite strange, actually, some of the echoes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for a really interesting reading and conversation. And thank you, Yasmine and Robin, and also Marina, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
It's been really interesting looking at translation as a real creative act among many other things. So
I'm sorry we didn't get your question, B. We should have mentioned that B is a scholar of Ibn Arabi.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Actually,
well, next time I'll save it. It was actually
a proper scholar of Ibn Arabi is actually sitting in the room.
Well, I don't know if I call myself that, but thank you so much, and thank you all for attending, and well, hope to see you again in future events. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice.
Thank you.
Thank you for everybody for coming. It was good fun. Yeah.